first minute's me talking about myself, so if anybody misses that, they have not missed much, have they? So let's get going. So hi everyone. Hope you've all had a good conference so far. My name's Chris Wade. Hopefully you will know I'm from a very small consultancy called Time for Impact. So small it's mostly me, really, in reality. And focusing mostly on volunteering and charity leadership, or I do little bits of HR and people stuff around the scenes as well. My three main missions, one of which we're talking about today, which is really helping organisations and volunteering teams in particular demonstrate the impact of their volunteering for their organisations and for the societies and the communities that they volunteer in or they work in. The second one is helping organisations really unlock what I always say is the goodwill that surrounds our causes, our organisations, and turning that into more participation and volunteering and involvement in our organisations. We know it's really hard for a lot of people to recruit volunteers at the moment, but with a bit of reinventing and reshaping volunteering, personally, I think there's an awful lot we can do to involve more people in our causes. And I will come back to your question in a second, Jess. And then the last thing I do, which is really a kind of labour of love, is after 25 years of working in volunteering, not quite 125 that Martin's done, but I'm working towards it. After all that time, just really helping shine a light on the things that I think are really interesting and really creative in volunteering, and trying to share those across the sector so we can all improve and we can all keep learning. And yes, as somebody has said in the chat, thank you for doing that for me, Vanessa. Yes, I shouldn't put the initials in there, should I? ROI, return on investment. So get something out for what we put in. Okay. Olivia, come over to the next slide, please. Thank you very much. So that's enough about me. So what we're going to try and do is still this morning is focus our minds on what it is we want to measure. What is the story that we want to tell about our volunteering and the impact that our volunteers make to our organisation. So this hopefully isn't a session about dry data and numbers. So if you wanted that, I'm sure you didn't, but you'd be disappointed. I really don't want to focus on that. For me, data impact is all about demonstrating and telling the story we want to tell about our volunteering, such that we can leverage influence, leverage cash, get more support for our volunteering. So that's what we're really going to be talking about, I hope, today. So we're talking about how we tell our story, who we're going to influence, a little bit about cultural intelligence. So how do we speak the same language or talk about the same subjects or the same pet projects that those that we want to influence are interested in. And then towards the end of the session, I'm going to focus a bit on balanced scorecards. There are many ways to measure impact. That is just but one. It's the one I tend to use an awful lot for many reasons. But I thought it would be useful just to sort of try and spell some of that out, give you a bit of an example of how they might work. And if you're interested in that sort of approach, then by all means do get in touch with me afterwards and I can talk you through in a lot more detail, because it would take me way more than 50 minutes to go over a balanced scorecard training session for you, but we can certainly help with some of that. I'd be interested to know, perhaps up front, if anybody is familiar with balanced scorecards and been using that, or if not, or either way, what your experience of gathering data and telling stories about your volunteering is so far. Perhaps just put a few sort of notes in the chat. Doesn't matter if you've got none. We all got to start somewhere. Jess hasn't heard of balanced scorecards. Hopefully you've heard of measuring your impact, but maybe how much of your time would you say you give of a typical month to looking at the impact of your volunteering? That would be interesting. Is it 10%, 20%, 30%, 100%?
Just 100% all the time.
All 100%. Well, I hope you are.
Volunteers don't get lucky.
Management as well. There's no right answers. No. So it sounds like it's new to people. Okay, well, hopefully you'll learn something new, if nothing else today, even if it's to say I'm never going to use that approach in my work. So yeah, let's move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So why focus on measuring the impact of volunteering? These are just a few personal reflections, I guess, really. It feels as I go around and talk to people, well, as I've done for 20 odd years, but also as I go around now as a consultant and I talk to agencies, I talk to CEOs and so on, almost, and I do put it in brackets for a reason, but almost everyone thinks volunteering is a good thing. Not many people will argue against it. It's like motherhood and apple pie. Everybody thinks, yeah, volunteering is a nice thing. They will tell you that volunteering is central to the delivery of their organization's mission. And often you hear people say, we can't do what we do without our volunteers. Heard those sort of things before? I certainly do. But yet, when I look around and when I get under the skin of volunteering organizations, I often find that the volunteering function within that organization is often pretty underfunded, if I'm honest. It's not getting the love, the attention, and the cash that it really needs. I see very busy volunteer managers, often on their own, sometimes part-time or doing it on the side of another job, trying to manage a group of people who really, we just said, we can't run our service without them. Yet we're not really providing the support that we should be to the people who are there to support, develop, and convene those experiences. When I see funding applications, I very rarely see volunteering fully funded or fully understood as part of the cost of running whatever project or service that we're trying to get funding for. It's often either missing altogether or assume that volunteering is free. I speak to trustees, I speak to directors and CEOs probably more often, and I ask them, what's the strategic value? What does it? How do your volunteers really bring forth and add value to your strategy as an organization? What impact do they have on your organization, on your society? And the answer to that is usually 2 or 3 seconds of blank face, followed by the cogs turning and trustees and directors starting to think, well, yes, they do X, Y, and Z. Or I get a very operational answer. I very rarely find executives who can, off the tip of the tongue, really tell us where volunteers make that strategic impact. I think volunteering is perceived by a lot of people as free. I'm sure you've all come across that. We all know it costs money, but the problem is if we perceive it as free as well, it means that people aren't paying the same attention to the value, the impact, the strategic contribution that volunteers make, because it's seen as something amateur or something that's just sort of organic and happens anyway. So that perception of free, I don't think helps us. And volunteering is often described as a program, a project, or whatever. And I don't have a problem with that. But actually, we need to remind people that volunteering is central to our strategy, is just central to our mission. So it's not something we just bolt on or that's temporary. It's something that should be in the very DNA of our organizations. So, yeah, why do we focus on measuring volunteering? For me, it's to answer some of those yet questions. Can we have the... Oh, before I move on, does that sound familiar to people? I'm hoping some people are going to say, no, our organization's nothing like that, which would be very good, but I suspect it is. So some of the internal reasons why we might focus on volunteering as well. Clearly, the better you know your own impact, the better capable you are of actually shaping future volunteering strategy and process and improving things going forward. Clearly, if you're demonstrating impact, you could have influence over those people who have got control of the purse strings, those people who can provide you influence, external funders, and so on. And if you're articulating impact to your... Oh, you've gone on just a little bit too quick for me. But if you're articulating...
Click the screen accidentally.
Maybe it's on the timer. Yes. So if you're able to demonstrate it to your volunteers and your supporters, clearly they'll be more motivated. That everyone knows that volunteers like to see the impact of their volunteering. It comes up in lots of surveys. We like to make a difference. We volunteer because we might like to make a difference in our community, etc. So clearly we want to be demonstrating that to our people. So yeah, someone just said this slide is very me. Well, actually, no, I think it's very volunteer manager. Or that is the life. I've not yet met a volunteer coordinator, or volunteer manager, volunteer professional who's not busy. They may be out there, but I've not met them yet. They usually completely run off their feet, just trying to manage an endless list of issues and people, and some of the stuff that Martin's dealt with, perhaps talked about earlier on, perhaps as well. As soon as you finish one project or one initiative, you're on to the next one. There's not much breathing space to stop, to take a stock of where we are as individuals or as projects or as an organization, and to think about, well, actually, how we're measuring the impact of what we do. Yet, we'll design new projects, and then after we put them into practice, we'll think, well, what is it actually we're trying to impact? Now that might be okay, but obviously it's going to be very difficult to gather the evidence, to provide evidence for the funding that you might need, or to influence your people in finance that they need to change their processes to support you and so on. So you do need to build in the processes up front if you possibly can. So there is something about taking a breather, taking time, investing a percentage of your time to think about what is it that actually we're trying to achieve here. Not least because we're actually, by going full steam ahead, we might end up developing the wrong services. So actually, while I'm talking about impact measures and so on, which sounds like it's an after the event thing, we're trying to measure how effective we've been, but often the process of deciding what measures and what impact we want to measure is really helpful in designing the strategies and the projects that we want to do in the first place. So for me, I think of impact measurement as much about planning the future as I do about measuring what's happened in the past. So it's really important to build in your thinking around what impact measurements do I need to gather up front, because that may actually find that helps us shape the projects that you're working on. Those of you who do project management will know that one of the things that projects always fail on is because they actually don't define what you're trying to achieve in the first place. That's one of the things that those projects fall down on. So if we're thinking about that up front, we're much more likely to be successful. So yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going to make volunteer managers even more busy than they were before. I'm just trying to read Jess's comment. It's important having the opportunity to come together as professionals to reflect and share, but carving out time is tricky. Yeah, I know it's tricky, and I don't have the magic wand for that one, unfortunately. But my view is that if you carve out time, both for thinking about things like this in terms of impact measurement, but actually also I agree with you on your wider point, carve out time for sharing with other professionals. That diversity of thought and that diversity of input will make our work more effective and our time more efficient, probably anyway. So it's worth doing. That's why we're all here, isn't it? Let's go to the next slide. So you will all have access to the data in your organizations in much more detail and readiness than I will, I hope, as an organization. So when I get to see an organization's volunteering metrics, I usually see what's written in the annual report or maybe in a press release if I'm lucky. What I tend to see, that you tell me if you think this is familiar, I tend to see lots of reporting on the number of volunteers, lots of reporting on the increase in volunteer numbers, which is great. Some information on the diversity of volunteers, which is important, the hours that they give, and usually some sort of estimated value of these hours, which is often quite meaningless in reality. And I might see some stuff on customer satisfaction or volunteering satisfaction. Yeah, all of those things, apart from perhaps the last one there, for me are just processes, inputs, and maybe outputs at best. They're not really measuring the outcome of volunteering. So, you know, if you looked at a commercial organisation, maybe, or just looked at any organisation, I think earlier on I mentioned the BBC, you wouldn't count the number of journalists the BBC have and say that's a measure of quality. It's a measure of quantity of people or inputs into a process. And so it doesn't really make sense to measure um, volunteering from how many volunteers are there and how many hours they have. And yet, I think somebody said it at the beginning here. People are always asking that question. Or was it on Martin's session? Always asking that question about how many volunteers do you have? I'm trying to measure quantity of input rather than quantity of output. So I think no one's going to do this for us. No one, well, unless you've got a really enlightened data team in your organization, which you might have, generally speaking, it's going to be incumbent on us as volunteering professionals to do something about this. To think about what is the value and the impact that our volunteering and our volunteers brings to the organization, to the society, and to the cause or whatever it is that we're working for. If we don't do it, however busy we are, I question who will. So I think it's on us. So let's go to the next. I'm sorry, losing the bottom of these slides. I think it's a display issue, but we're not missing any major content. Don't worry. If you do, I'll read it out for you. So I often think of data as a sort of springboard into action rather than the destination. I think very often we think of data, I should say from the outset, or I should have said earlier really, that when I'm talking about data, I'm talking about information. So it could be qualitative as well as quantitative data. It could be case studies as well as facts and numbers and figures and so on. It's, as I said earlier on, it's all about telling the story. But for me, data shouldn't be for data's sake. It should be a springboard to a destination which is better selling the story that we want told about our volunteering and leveraging the influence that comes with that. So just a few things to think about. Data is really good at sort of strengthening our message, making it more convincing to potential donors or to executives at the top of the organization. So with the data, we can speak with more credibility, and we can ask for influence with more credibility because we can come with numbers rather than just sort of saying, well, you know, volunteering is a lovely thing, isn't it? So it helps add weight to our arguments. Data is very good at showing our community, our volunteers, our donors, our funders, etc., how the contributions they make to our organisation make a difference, and that in itself fosters trust and long-term support. So it brings a sort of transparency to what we do. And of course, it helps us identify areas that we can or we need to improve in order to maximise our input. So it's about improvement of our organisation or of our function. Next slide, please. So yeah, I like to think of data or information as a superpower for volunteer managers. I mean, volunteer managers have got plenty of superpowers. You'll say we don't need any more. We're all superhuman anyway. We have to be to do all the things that we do. But actually, data and information just helps make us more effective. So we can use it to build a case for future investment in our programs or expansion of the programs. Or I'm using the word program now, have you noticed? Expansion of our volunteering activities or our initiatives. Helps us to build that business case. We can use it to motivate volunteers, of course, by showing the work that or the contribution that they make to the organisation. But we can also use it to motivate staff. And I don't know about you, but as volunteer managers, we have to spend, or volunteer leaders, we have to spend some of our time not just supporting the volunteers that we work with, but a lot of the time selling volunteering to the rest of the organisation. I don't know if that sounds familiar, but often, you know, and it's fair enough if you're a member of the HR team or in finance or wherever in your organisation, it's not necessarily true that you'll understand the volunteering in the way that we do as professionals, but it does mean as individuals we have to spend a lot of time, which could be quite wearing, explaining why volunteering is really important. Well, data, of course, can help us do that, can't it? So it's power to your elbow. It can help us recruit new volunteers. I love it personally when I see on a volunteer recruitment page on a website or some social media some stats about what a great impact our volunteers make. And again, it doesn't have to be a statistic; it could be a lovely case study, a nice video, etc. It helps us build trust with our supporters, or in your case, visitors as well, or the local community. Obviously, it helps us highlight progress over time. So we can show that we're continuously improving. And that links to one just a couple down there about honesty and transparency for me, because actually I don't think as a sector we're always very good at showing what we're not good at. And that sounds really weird because none of us usually, if you turn on the BBC or you listen to somebody talking about anything, they're always talking about how great they are, which is great. But actually sometimes when we're using data, it's useful to say, yeah, we're doing this quite well, or we're doing this okay, but actually with your help and your investment or a bit more resource or a bit more time or some extra training, we could be much better and we can make a bigger impact. So don't be afraid of being transparent and honest about what areas for improvement, because actually there are opportunities for you to get more support. Cost effectiveness, of course, we probably don't spend a lot of time on cost effectiveness as much as we should in volunteering, because by its nature, volunteering is not always the most productive, because we know the volunteers, like to be self-determined, they like flexibility, like to develop their own ways. It comes with its own kind of way of working, which can be very productive. But it's quite hard to control, I suppose, the cost effectiveness. But actually, if you find that deploying a volunteer in a certain part of your visitor attraction, for instance, and it has you did it on a Tuesday and it worked really well, that data is going to help you make a case to get more volunteers to do it on Thursdays and Fridays as well. Although Margaret volunteers on Fridays, doesn't she? So sorry, Martin. So think about that. And then counterfactuals. Think about, I think fundraising are really good at counterfactuals, but think of ways where you can show, well, without these volunteers, X, Y, and Z would never happen. And the organisation would be less effective. And the bit that you can't read at the bottom of the screen for some reason is just saying, don't forget to include really nice human narratives and human stories, because they pull at the heartstrings, of course. So next slide, please. Thank you, Olivia. Oh, we're all doing okay so far. I'll pause for a little bit in case there's any questions. Well, you can admire my chicken and egg pictures. Yeah, everybody okay so far?
Yeah, it's looking good. We've had a few nice comments in the chat, just saying it's sounding very familiar and the reframing is a good reflection. Yeah, feel free to keep posting anything. I'm monitoring the chat, so if you do want to.
Yeah. Otherwise, I'll just keep talking, which you might want, but so yeah, I do think of sometimes of this kind of work as a kind of chicken and egg thing, and I never really come to an answer in my own head. Sometimes I get involved in I use balance scorecards quite a lot, but sometimes I'd get involved in working with a team who've already got a volunteering strategy in place, and we develop a scorecard that helps measure that, and that's great. And obviously it's a living document, so it keeps evolving over time, so it will keep feeding in back and forward into the people's strategy. But I've worked with organisations who haven't really got a volunteering strategy, but develop the measures, and actually by the art of really focusing on what it is we need to what our objectives as a volunteering function, what are the things we're trying to achieve. you build a scorecard of way how you want to measure that, but by asking those questions, what is it we're trying to deliver as a volunteering function, actually you actually get into the world of developing strategy anyway. The two go hand in hand. So sometimes you might do it that way around. And what I think is really important for volunteer managers to understand is if you're using it as you get better at this and you're developing a living balanced scorecard with goals, objectives, and deliverables that's demonstrating your impact. When your organization next gets to the phase where it wants to develop its 3-year, 5-year, whatever strategy and plan, you'll be one of those departments that for this time around, we'll be able to say, well, look, we've got loads of evidence that shows X, Y, and Z. This is really important, and this can start to influence our organizational strategic plan. So I'm hoping it will start to tie you much closer into the organizational decision making on a longer term basis rather than a sort of transactional one-off basis as well. So do think of this thing in much wider than just metrics and measuring. It has the power to really start to shape where volunteering fits operationally, but also culturally in the organization. So let's move on. Next slide, please. So before we do anything else, I mean, for me, if you're not doing anything else as a volunteering person, when we're talking about juggling the balls and carving out time, my first thing is spend some time really getting to know your strategic plan. Some of you will know your organization strategy and missions inside out, and that's great. Some of you will have read them, probably put them to one side and look at it occasionally, and some won't take much notice at all. So I expect it'll be varied, but I can't emphasize enough how important it is to really understand those plans, understand how you fit into them, where your volunteers are really driving success in those strategies, where it fits well, but also identifying where if there's any gaps where your volunteering activity could add more value to the strategy, could make a bigger contribution, or where there's areas where your volunteering is really sort of cracking on in its own silo, but actually probably not making much difference to the strategy of the organization. And that might be fine, but clearly the more you can be aligned with your organization strategy, the more likely you're going to be successful at leveraging some influence and having people at least hear what you have to say around the decision-making tables. So yeah, next slide, please, Olivia. And this is just a continuation of the same thing. You can do this in your own time. Everybody's used a SWOT analysis many times, I know, but actually it's quite useful just to maybe work with some volunteers and work with with your colleagues, and also work with some colleagues in other departments across the organisation to really sort of critique your volunteering activity and your volunteering strategy, and work out where does it really align and really bolster the organisation strategy. Are there weaknesses where the work isn't aligned? Are there opportunities where you could do more to deliver the strategy and you could make a case for future activities? Or are there threats where your volunteering gets really misaligned with your strategy? Right. Sorry. Next slide, please. So all that brings me to close now to developing a balanced scorecard. In fact, let's go on to the next slide. Thank you. So, as a few of you said you'd used balanced scorecard before. I'm sure most of you would recognise one of you saw one anyway, or a lot of you would have done anyway. They were developed about 30 odd years ago at Harvard University by Kaplan and Norton, you must know. And the reason for them being developed was really initially for commercial companies, and they wanted to see if there were better ways for investors in commercial companies to make a decision whether to invest or not in X, Y, or Z company. And they recognised that investors at the time were mostly making investments in the profitability, the balance sheets, the market share, all the financial indicators of an organisation, but not really understanding other predictors of potential future success. For instance, what their relationship is with their customers. Is there new markets that they can go into? Have they got technology that would be particularly effective in the future? Those sort of things aren't really covered in looking at someone's balance sheet or someone's profit and loss accounts. So they felt they needed other measures. And as they started developing these, not only did they start to see that, yes, actually there are better measures of an organization which will make better investment decisions, but actually those organizations who were using balanced scorecards internally to measure their own effectiveness, by having that balanced overview of their organization, they were actually becoming far more, they were outperforming other organizations who were measuring themselves on financial metrics alone. So actually, by forcing internally the mindset that you start to look at an organization much more holistically, you get a much better view, and you're continually developing a much richer organization. And since then, people have started developing balanced scorecards for non-commercial companies, and I'll come on to some of that in a minute. Let's go to the next slide. So the reasons, or the success, the reasons for using a balanced scorecard in a nutshell is it allows you to measure outcome measurements. It's tied really closely to your organizational strategy, both now and the future, both what you're doing now and what you can do in the future. It focuses people's minds on where they can make the most difference. So activity and energy is all focused on those areas. So you've heard the quote that, we are what we do, what we measure, or we are what we measure. So, if you're measuring the right things, it tends to focus activity onto those initiatives and onto that focus. Clearly, it helps drive good decision making around investment. So it allows you to go to funders or other bodies with a really good case to make get them to make donations or investments in your work. It helps you develop an understanding across staff, management, leadership, supporters, potentially all understand that not only this is the value of volunteers, but these are the things that we're particularly measuring and recognizing as the values and the impact of volunteering. So that conversation that you keep having about, with the finance team about why volunteers are important, hopefully becomes a little bit more easy. It gives you the tools to measure not just success now, but progress and plan the next steps in your organization or in your function. Helps you demonstrate that return on investment, and it helps you influence internal decision making from the board, and to get the money and the resources and the staffing, etc., that you might want. All right so far? Talk to me, people.
It's been great. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Oh, we've got a thumbs up from Martin.
Good. So I'll get on to balanced scorecards. Next slide. And please don't get hung up on the technology or the technicalities of this. It really is, as I said at the beginning, it's about finding a tool that helps demonstrate and tell the story of the impact of your volunteering. That's all we're simply trying to do. But the scorecards give us a template, if you like, for doing that. So this is a traditional balanced scorecard for a commercial company, or at least it's a very simplified version of a balanced scorecard for a traditional commercial company. So the top left corner, and you can change these around because the balance for your organization might be slightly different than from other, and it is about balance rather than being constrained by a model. But typically, the top left corner, we're talking about the things that really drive the mission of the organization. And of course, for a commercial company, the mission of an organization is more often than not, although it's changing slightly, around making cash, making money, isn't it? So not surprisingly, in a traditional balanced scorecard, finances is usually in the top left corner. What's the market share? What's the what are the indicators of financial health for that organization? Um, in a social or an NGO organization, very often that's slightly different because remember when we said it's about the mission of the organization. Actually, the mission of a social organization is often going to be much different. It's going to be about developing a cause, moving, developing services to vulnerable people, or building knowledge in a local community. It's those kind of whatever your missions are for your organization. So in there, you're going to have the things that really drive your organizational, from a volunteering point of view, you're going to have the things that really drive your organizational strategy forward, what your potential donors or trust funds, etc., will want to be work closely with a council. It's going to involve lots of the sort of metrics and the ambitions of the local council in that corner. And then the top right is traditionally the customer influence. So you can have the best organization in the world, but if you're not pleasing your customers, or your customers aren't interested in you or ignoring you, you've got a problem. Well, that's the same. Obviously, for a commercial company, it's the same for a social company. And our customers are usually, in our case, as we're talking about volunteering, are our volunteers. But you might put in there some of your visitor metrics as well. They could go top left or top right. But really, if you want to see the success of a volunteering organisation, we need to be looking at the customer satisfaction, but also things like customer health. Volunteer satisfaction, the health of volunteers, employability, the breaking loneliness, all those kind of issues as well that we might want to be putting in that quadrant. And then we guess a little bit different when you get down to the bottom left, because the bottom left is about learning and growth. And I always call it is about potential. So if that was Amazon, for example, in the learning and growth quadrant, I might have, well, I want to develop technology to deliver parcels the same day by those little drone things and dropping them in the back garden, which I know they're working out at the moment, or looking at some new changes to the algorithms to get more customers involved, or increasing the marketplace, and so on and so forth. Well, for us in non-commercial organisations, that's going to be more about improving the organisation. So it might be, so we're talking about volunteering, it might be an investment in some training in volunteers, so they can provide better customer service. It might be some really specific knowledge-based stuff around a particular exhibition that you're putting on. I don't know. You know more about your sector than I do, but they're going to be different things. So making the case to say, well, we're really good, but if we were going to invest in X, Y, and Z, we can do even better. We could help improve our outcomes. So it's about growth and potential. And then the bottom right, I always call the business is the internal business processes, but I always think of it as like the sort of cash cow of the organisation. These are the things that we have to get right. They're often quite normal things that we do all the time, but the quality of them make the biggest impact. So if it could be that the quality of our training is the thing in our volunteering world that really drives success in our organisation. It's the knowledge that our volunteers have and that makes a difference. So that will be in that quadrant, because it's, if we don't get that right, customer service drops off, people stop visiting. Yeah, you'll know the examples. I'm probably giving very bad ones, but you get the drift. So they're about the things that we need to do really well. And for each of those 4 quadrants, we need to develop some goals of what good looks like and some objectives. And only when we got those in our head, this is what good looks like, and then we can start to draw up the metrics, how we measure them. Don't start with the metrics first and go the other way around, because otherwise we just end up measuring what we've got rather than actually focusing on the outcomes that we need. So I'll pause again. Am I making sense? Anybody got any questions so far? I'm going to go into these in a bit more detail, but
You're making sense, Chris. We've not had too much in the chat, but now is a good time if anyone does want to jump in with anything. Feel free.
How are we doing for time?
We're we're 13 past 12, so we're going slightly more slowly than the last session, but that's absolutely fine because we did finish 15 minutes ahead of time last session, so we were very good time. Yeah. But yeah, I think if no one's got any questions at the minute, we'll keep going.
Well, let's go through a bit of an example then. So let's move on. Go to the next slide. So
Very good.
if you imagine this this is our top left quadrant. Oh, we've lost the picture. Actually,
Oh,
so
has it?
this is our investor quadrant. This is investing in our mission. So this is probably your chief exec or your chair of trustees or somebody like that, or it could be a trust fund or somebody else or the local council who are going to give you some money. So we need to think about. I'm just reading the comments. Yeah. So so we need to think about how we would influence decisions. So what do we need to put in our outputs and our outcomes and our goals and our objectives that are going to be important to this person? So let's use the council as an example. I don't know your particular areas, but when I read council plans, for instance, I often see things around impact on the local community, building. If I read that this is the council's plans, I read about building social cohesion, reducing health inequalities, reducing loneliness, boosting the educational or the education of the local populace, building bridges between people, employability, increasing economic investment, and so on and so forth. So for me, in this quadrant, what I'm often thinking about is what are the things in those plans that my organisation and my volunteering can contribute to. Now, you're not going to be able to deliver social cohesion on your own. I recognise that, but actually, you can build a case where your volunteering is helping to build social cohesion in the local community, and they're the sort of things you start off as an objective or an outcome, and then you build back to say, well, actually, how do we measure our contribution towards that? And so you might be collecting data like surveys before and after, some case studies. You might have a pilot in one part of the organisation that you think you could extend, or you could just be gathering data on action. So I'm just reading Anna's comment. How long does it take to develop a scorecard? It's not. There's no real answer to that, but it's not an easy investment of time. I'm not going to lie to you, Anna. It does take time to develop one. I think you need to sit down with your colleagues, your volunteers. If you can afford someone like myself to come and help, that helps. But actually, it does take time to really dig into what it is that makes a difference. I would say you've got to give yourself a good 5 or 6 days minimum of work to really create a good one, but it will pay dividends in the long run for you. So yeah, it's it is an investment in time. You can do it on the cheap, and something is always better than nothing. But actually, you do need some time to really get under the skin of this. And I think often the knowledge isn't in the heads of one person. It needs bringing lots of people together to really get under the skin of this. Bring some donors in, bring some members from other departments in it. The richer the conversation you can afford to have, better the answers will be to be that one. But I'm always happy to have a chat afterwards, of course. I don't charge you for that. That's free. So let's go on to the top right quadrant, next slide, which is our archetypal volunteer. If you can move on, Olivia.
Yeah, so I think I changed and then it lags a bit for everyone else.
It's going around the world and coming back to us.
It clearly is, yeah.
So Martin's probably going it first, who's in Bangkok. So yes, so this is our volunteer. So this should be the easier one for us as professionals, because if we don't know our volunteers, then I'd be worried. But thinking about what it is in terms of the outcomes or the impact that we want to see on our volunteers in our organisation. So things like obviously satisfaction, but also their development within their role. We know that people join us because they want to develop new skills sometimes. Their confidence in volunteering, has that improved over time? Their employability, linking back to what the council might want. So are they feeling more confident about their job prospects potentially as a result of what they're doing with you? Over students, that might be important. Their health, what impact does it have on their health, on their loneliness, their social isolation? Are they feeling more able to participate and contribute to your organisation than they were before? And then you might have the stuff around diversity. Are you bringing in the right sort of diversity of thought and communities and so on into your organisation? So I was thinking lots of questionnaires. I mean, don't overdo the questionnaires because volunteers get really fed up with endless questionnaires. So you've got to get the balance right. So again, you've got to ask the right questions because nobody hates anything more than asking loads of questions that nobody's ever going to use. But running them, maybe some pulse surveys, so they're sort of short and sweet over regular interviews rather than great big 15 pages surveys. But nonetheless, you need that sort of information. Some lovely case studies. You all should be able to provide lovely case studies about the impact that individual or groups of volunteers are made, and so on. So that's volunteers. That one's easy, I hope, for all of you. Let's go to the next slide, which is the one about potential. And for me, this is the most exciting. This is the bit I always like, the quadrant I like the most, because this is about saying, as a volunteer manager, actually, our volunteer is really good. But you know what? With a bit of help and a bit of money and a bit of time from the organisation or from an external funder, we can be even better. So, this group of volunteers are doing a really great thing. But if we can just invest in their training a little bit more, they could be even more effective. Or, we tried this in our site in Manchester. We'd like to try it over in Wakefield as well, because we think it would work there too. It's those kind of questions where, can we add a little bit more value to the organisation? So that's that quadrant. Let's go to the next one. And then the next one's about process. What are the key processes, as I say, that really make a difference to us as a volunteering, to our organisation through our volunteering? What is it that our volunteers do or our volunteering managers do that is absolutely essential? We took it apart, it would all fall apart. If we got rid of it, it's the thing that glues the whole organisation together, or the whole function together. So it could be our training, it could be our recruitment processes. You'll know what it is in your organisation. But if we can identify what those things are and how they make a difference and what they're there to achieve, we need to obviously clearly monitor how effective they are, and obviously look for ways to improve those, because if we can do them better, we'll be even more effective. So let's go to the next one. So yeah. So just as a summary, really, balanced scorecards, or whatever tool you like to use, for me, yes, they are an evaluation tool, and that's really important. We all have to evaluate how effective our work is. But actually, for me, I think it's much more than that. It's a planning document, so it helps us develop going forward and improve the way we're going to be working as a team or as a volunteering function. But there's also an advocacy tool. It's a storytelling tool that allows us to prove to our colleagues, to ourselves, but to our colleagues, our funders, our leadership, that actually volunteering is really strategic, makes an impact on our organisation's mission, but also is worthy of investment of time, money, and influence. So I wanted to read you something, if I can find it again, which a book called Good to Great in the Social Sectors. I don't know if anyone else has read that. The last time somebody had, but I found out afterwards, Matt. I think Matt's read everything, hasn't he? So that's no surprise. But by a guy called Jim Collins, really well worth reading. It's about 35 pages long, so it's an easy read. It's not going to take you long. But anyway, there's a quote in here which I thought really fits well with this. And he says, "It doesn't really matter whether you can quantify your results. which sounds contradictory to what I've just told you. But he says, what matters is that you rigorously assemble evidence. So it's important that we spend time on rigorously assembling evidence, whether that's qualitative or quantitative, to track your progress. If the evidence is primarily qualitative, think like a lawyer, a trial lawyer, trying to assemble the combined body of evidence to prosecute a case. And I think that's often where we are as volunteers. So we're not going to be able to demonstrate through qualitative evidence everything that we want to do. But if we think of it as a trial lawyer trying to build a case, I think that's really important. And if it's primarily quantitative, then think of yourself as a laboratory scientist assembling and assessing data. And I think that actually that's quite a good little mindset to think about how we need to get involved in using our data to tell our stories. So let's go to the next one. And then, yeah, as I say, I think data can be really boring, can be really dull, but actually data isn't about data for data's sake or collecting it for the sake of it. It's about telling your story. And we know from the beginning that volunteering story is not told the way it should be told. It's not as loud as it should be. So use data, use information as an amplifier to tell your story much louder and more effectively than you would have done otherwise. So next slide, we're getting there. And we come to questions really. Before I get to questions, just so we go through the slides, one of the things you might find interesting is Matt Cobble and I run a regular Time for Impact podcast. You might, in fact, Matt Hick was our very first guest on the podcast way back when, so you can listen to that one if nothing else. But there's links there to the three of them. We don't just talk about impact; we talk about volunteering and we talk about innovation in volunteering. So you might find some stuff interesting, less about me and much more from my guests, and you'll see that's still one of our more recent podcasts. In the picture there is us with Carol, who's the global head of volunteering for Parkrun. So any parkrunners might find that one interesting at least. So please do have a look. And if you want to contact me, my details are on the next slide. But that's about me. We've got time for questions, Olivia.